Good day to everyone. Thank you very much for joining and welcome to the June 2022 Food Thinkers. This Food Thinkers is part of a series of Food Thinkers that has been running for a long time, but our 2021-2022 Food Thinkers has been dedicated to sharing big ideas from women in academia, in business, in civil society and in policy. And I'm delighted to welcome Jessica Duncan, a really big thinker, to give the talk today. Who's going to be talking about power and participation in an era of food systems governance. My name is Professor Corinna Hawkes. I'm Director of the Centre for Food Policy, and I'm delighted to be moderating the event today. We'll start with around a 40-minute presentation. As Jess is speaking, please do write any questions into the Q&A box, into the Q&A, not the chat, please. And then I will moderate those questions to Jess after her talk. And we do have a substantial amount of time for questions, so do keep them coming in. And there's always a very rich discussion at these Food Thinkers. And if you want to tweet about the talk, please use the hashtag Food Thinkers and the handle @FoodPolicyCity. Before I introduce Jess, just a couple more housekeeping notices. If you want to receive our monthly newsletter with information about the Food Thinkers, do put your email address into the chat box in order that we can add you. And we get a lot of inquiries always about our master's programme and our new BSc in Nutrition and Food Policy. So you can find details of both programmes also as well. The webinar is being recorded and it will be made available online afterwards via our YouTube channel. So, Jess, thank you very much for speaking to us today. You're a researcher, you're an educator, and someone that anyone has seen any of your work is clearly extremely committed to social justice. It's great to have one of our alumni talk today. You got your PhD in food policy from the Centre for Food Policy back in 2014, and of course now an associate professor in the politics of food systems in the rural sociology groups at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Jess is widely recognised for her expertise on the politics of the sustainable food system transition, particularly on the practice and politics of participation. And I'd recommend, in addition to this talk tonight, listening to the podcasts and the writings and so on, and books that Jess has put out. They're a very important contribution. She's also served on various committees and is a founding member of the wonderfully titled Centre for Unusual Collaborations, a project for Dutch universities. So delighted to have you here, and please, we look forward to hearing from you on power and participation in an era of food systems governance. Over to you, Jess.
Yeah, thank you, Corinna. Thank you very much for having me. It's truly an honor and so great to be back participating with the Centre for Food Policy, which is indeed my former stomping grounds. I hate to say this 2.5 years into this crisis or even longer, but I assume you can see my slides,
yes,
message okay, great. The message I normally have has disappeared. So I also want to thank Elaine and your whole team, Corinna, for putting this together, because it's been remarkably well facilitated on this side. So my name is Jessica Duncan. I work at Wageningen University in the Netherlands as associate professor in the politics of sustainable food system transformation. And I'm going to talk to you about these issues of power and participation, which keep me up at night. And I want to start by showing you this image. This is a picture by Boy Dominguez. And I love this picture because I think it illustrates so very well my own research agenda. So I researched the different ways that diverse groups of people come together or separate to advance their vision for more just and sustainable food systems. And I'm in particular interested in these relations between food movements and also between food movements and public policymakers. And I think this painting so nicely illustrates these diverse struggles that happen in our food system and the efforts that people make to try and achieve this change in the center. And as I'm going to hopefully articulate to you this afternoon, power and participation are key to their successes and failures. Now, Corinne mentioned that I got my PhD at City and I now work at Wageningen. Here I chair the Masters of Organic Agriculture and have been working with this exciting Center for Unusual Collaborations. But I also play a role for the European Commission as an expert for the Standing Committee on Agricultural Research in their foresight team. And we finished our foresight report just at the end of 2020. And we are now revisiting this foresight report in light of the current crises. And this is actually, in this moment of crisis, this is where my story tonight will begin. My story tonight will contain 5 chapters and an epilogue. It's designed to raise more questions than it answers. The main characters are food movements, policymakers, and scientists. The story focuses on an epic battle for influence, power, resources, and futures. This battle plays out in a complex, contentious, and uneven landscape. While all the characters might share similar visions for the future, the pathways they identify for achieving these futures are quite distinct. The question is, will they work together to achieve the future they seek? Or will some win while others get left behind? So as I mentioned, our story starts at this moment now of compounding crisis. When we think about these crises, first of all, we must not forget that they are opportunities for change, but they are also opportunities to entrench power. And these crises are set to affect all dimensions of food security and nutrition and continue to overstretch local, national, and international capacities and resources. Crises provide an important moment for change, as I mentioned, but if we look back to the 2007 and 8 crises and the aspirations we held at that moment, I think many of us can say that our aspirations did not come to fruition. Further, we already see very powerful interests stepping in and shaping the narrative when it comes to transformations in light of the current war in the Ukraine. It is in this moment of compounding crises that we need to demand policies and take action to take into account the 3 dimensions of sustainable development. And here is where the conundrum emerges that led me down the governance rabbit hole. We have the situation where weak governance has got us into a lot of this mess, and we need good governance to get us out of this mess. Now, governance is a tricky word. It's often said that it means everything and therefore nothing. But for the purposes of our story, here are a few definitions to explain at least how I understand governance. First of all, governance refers to these institutions, actors, rules, norms, and power relations that give shape to the practices of governing how food is produced, distributed, accessed, utilized, and wasted. At the same time, governance as a sphere is constituted by competing and overlapping networks composed of actors who draw on vastly different resources in exercising their power and their capacity to participate. When we think about governance, it's also helpful to think about what is effective or good governance. And 2 elements of effective governance relates to legitimacy and authority. And these are going to be 2 of the key threads that I weave through the story tonight. So expanding on these elements, with my colleagues, Matt Canfield and Priscilla Claes, we have reflected on the role of legitimacy and authority in food systems governance, both as tools, but also as sites of contestation. With respect to legitimacy, we have questioned what counts as a legitimate process in food systems governance, especially given the importance of participation. Indeed, several authors have talked about participation as the new orthodoxy. But who, and maybe even what, represents legitimate participation? How to balance policy and action, and who has legitimacy to push action? With respect to authority, we question how authority is claimed in food governance debates. Who is claiming the right to speak as an authority on food systems? How does this play out in ongoing discussions and debates around science policy interfaces, for example? And these science policy interfaces will make an appearance later in our story. So as we move through our story, I want to introduce you to Chapter 2, The Emperor's New Summit. In light of the context and conditions that I've just already articulated in these compounding crises, already back in 2019, the Secretary General of the United Nations announced the organization of a food system summit. The aim was to mobilize and catalyze action in service of the Sustainable Development Goals. Details of the summit remained a bit fuzzy for those of us on the outside, but it was clear that this event was about action. It was to include the private sector in a leading role, capitalizing off a strategic partnership signed by the United Nations and the World Economic Forum. And importantly, it was going to be a people summit, committed to ensuring widespread engagement and participation from stakeholders around the world. Now, those of us who've been working in this domain for a long time, were thrilled to see food systems make it to the international agenda. And the summit was hopeful. You see here that taken from the website, we can build a just and resilient world where no one is left behind and transforming food systems is within reach. As the preparations progressed, we saw that progress was being made and more than 1,200 ideas were being put forward to help meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And in various waves, these summary tables of game-changing propositions were being put forward, that had been collected from people all over the world, and we're providing ideas for how we can really change the future of our food systems. And yet, within all of this, cracks started to appear. Despite the enthusiasm and the clear need to draw attention to food systems, critiques began to emerge. So in The Guardian, there was an article about farmers and rights groups boycotting this food summit over links to big business. Scientists banded together to boycott the summit. And networks of civil society actors, particularly more radical food movements, but also NGOs and movements like Slow Food, came together in a people summit of their own, saying we cannot jump on a train that is headed in the wrong direction. Now, when we think about what the key concerns were, when we reflect back, we can summarize them as follows. The first concern was that the summit was not grounded in people or human rights, nor in systems change. There were concerns about the role of corporate interests and the domination of those interests in the agenda of the summit. There were concerns around a very narrow vision of science and evidence. There were concerns that the summit could replace existing international public institutions with multi-stakeholder platforms. And there was also a lack of clarity around outcomes and accountability following the summit that made people question what the impact could be and what the impact would be. So this moves us to Chapter 4. What happens when not all the stakes are the same? At this point in our story, we turn to reflecting on the aims to make the UN Food System Summit a people summit, a summit that is deeply participatory, and we want to reflect on what this means for governance. So we come back to this question of legitimacy in food governance in terms of process and participation. And here on the screen, you can see a response that was written to that article in The Guardian about civil society boycotting the summit. This comment or letter has been written by a special envoy to the summit, Dr. Agnes Kalibata, who's also president of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. And she published this piece noting that all stakeholder interests would be considered in the United Nations Food System Summit. And indeed, the scale of participation was impressive and probably unprecedented. If you look here, you see that they claim to have had over 850 dialogues with over 100,000 people participating from around the world, representing a good number of stakeholder groups. And importantly, from my perspective, as someone who engages and believes in public policy, and so very good for our story, a lot of good governmental representation. But many critique the question of what it means to be invited to a dinner party when the table is set, the menu decided, and the seating order already arranged. The concern for participation and for people was that participation was being used as a tool by the summit to claim legitimacy. And this is a key point, because previous international summits like this, previous global summits, have been organized through multilateral institutions of the United Nations and have respected normative frameworks of public international law through which the United Nations has generally operated. Now, these previous summits, here, states were primary participants and states had obligations. This was not the case with the UN Food System Summit. So new mechanisms of legitimacy were needed. And much of the discourse related to the importance of action was also guiding this. So what we heard when we spoke to organizers of the summit and when we spoke to people who were promoting the summit was that politicians have had their chance. Governments have had their chance and they failed us. They're acting too slowly. We need change now. And that innovation comes from maybe the more engagement from the private sector and from people. Now, this effort to claim legitimacy via participation is aligned with this principle of the all affected. This is this idea that all who are affected by a decision should have the right to participate into making it. And this is a compelling principle, if impractical. The normative force comes from the value of personal autonomy, but it prevents people from constituting themselves as their own demos. Further, many proponents have failed to account for relations of power and influence and failed to recognize that not all people are affected equally, and not everyone has contributed to the problem equally, and not everyone has the same legitimacy to be there. It also raises questions about the over-inclusion of certain groups, as we saw in the lead up to the summit. And as I already mentioned, the participatory approach to legitimacy in food systems governance is prevalent. It has now become status quo, and it is fundamental that we maintain participation in food governance and food systems governance. But the way that it's operationalized in many cases now is deeply problematic in the way that it is devoid of reflections on power. So to raise awareness of this trend, many pointed to this idea of multi-stakeholderism, and this image and definition comes from this alternative People's Food Systems for People Summit. So multi-stakeholderism is a strategy used to engage affected communities and groups of marginalized by the food system together with other stakeholders to negotiate as equals under the premise of promoting partnership and cooperation. However, studies of these processes and their outcomes show us, and many of us are familiar with these perhaps and have experienced these, many of these processes have come to serve to reinforce the status quo. So rather than pushing sort of transformative visions, we end up finding that such multi-stakeholder processes serve to reify existing pathways and lock us into existing ways of doing things. Now, I think Sofia Monsalve explains things really well here. She says the multi-stakeholder model of governance is problematic because it sounds very inclusive. This idea of the People Summit, everyone has a seat at the table. But in fact, we are worried about the concealing of power asymmetries without having a clear rule in terms of accountability. What is the rule here and who decides? Now, I want to contextualize this a bit because this is a trend that expands far beyond the UN Food Systems Summit. I want to give a short example from a forthcoming UN program exercise on food system transformations that I was just sent. So if you see here, they suggest that the secret sauce for working together on systems change is a shared vision, systems intelligence, and the right people. It sounds good, but there's no effort to reflect on the power asymmetries between these powerful, influential people that they list here on the bottom and the marginalized groups that follow. There are no concrete mechanisms proposed, at least yet, to address these inequalities. And there's no discussion on what proportion of people should be represented in these spaces, what makes the right mix of people. So when it comes to legitimacy in food systems governance, this question of the all-effective principle and multi-stakeholderism matters because the theory suggests that this could very well pose a threat to multilateralism or public governance. We are at risk of having these multi-stakeholder platforms replace democratically accountable fora. I want to show you another example to illustrate what I'm talking about. So this comes from a recent report from the Joint Council of Research of the European Commission, where experts fed into this concept report promoting stakeholder processes to be hosted, but not run by the European Union. They call instead for these stakeholder processes to be co-owned by participants. Now, for me as a governance scholar, this is a terrifying trend. To remove ownership from democratically accountable bodies and to transfer the work and accountability to stakeholders is deeply problematic for the future of our food systems and our democracies more broadly. Yet this is the same model of accountability that was promoted through the UN Food Systems Summit. This brings us to some of the solutions that I might propose today, or that I'd like to engage with you or discuss perhaps through the question period. Many civil society actors are pushing against the all-affected principle, away from multi-stakeholderism towards what some have called the most affected principle. This principle is also compelling and also probably very impractical. Its normative force comes from the recognition of power and impact. It concerns issues of categorization and prioritization of some of these categories, such as small-scale farmers, women, the urban poor. The principle has been trialed. It's been taken up in the reform of the Committee on World Food Security and has been reinforced through the autonomous civil society and Indigenous peoples mechanism. But it comes from a long history of movement organizing, of trial, of error, and political participation. And with my colleague Priscilla Clays, we have documented how this principle, when applied, can very usefully re-politicize governance spaces. Using tools such as constituencies or your primary political identity, maybe it's a woman, maybe it's youth, maybe it's farmer, maybe it's researcher, but using these constituencies and issues, things like quotas. Through this, we've documented how this approach can be very effective in actually supporting alliance building while respecting the diversity of experiences that these different constituency categories experience and the different visions they have for their food system. We've also documented how these kinds of approaches, this politicized approach to participation, can also better support direct representation in policymaking spaces, ensuring that those who are most impacted and most affected are speaking for themselves. And this brings us to chapter 5, A Hero Comes Along. And this moves us also to the next element of our story, which relates back to this element of governance. Who is claiming, of authority, not governance, who is claiming the authority to speak for food systems and whose claims are being heard? Now, if you see this text on the right, maybe it's difficult to read for you, but it comes from part of the scientific, it's from a draft report from the scientific group of the Food Systems Summit. And what's interesting for me also about the Food Systems Summit was that it aimed not only to be people-driven, but science-driven. Now, this double effort could be one of the great tensions of our story. How do we manage to do both? And indeed, that warrants its own lecture. But what is important at this stage for our story is to reflect on the way in which science, in a very narrow understanding of science, was positioned as driving innovations. This approach to science raises questions about our legitimacy as scientists to drive societal change, something we turn to in the next chapter. But it's also important insofar as science was positioned as a voice of authority in the food system. The solutions and actions put forward had to be based in this very narrow understanding of science. And as a scientist, I am all in favor of evidence, but there is a rich body of literature that outlines the way in which science is used as a discourse of power and delay that needs to be brought to the fore, though that is probably for a sequel. I think there's also growing trends in other international fora like climate change and especially biodiversity and I think also our lessons from the COVID-19 crisis that suggest that if we don't expand our understanding of knowledge, and if we don't expand what counts as valid knowledge in these food system spaces, as scientists, we're very vulnerable to becoming, to being seen as a bit old-fashioned, obsolete, and out of touch with contemporary democratic processes. So I raise these concerns not only in solidarity with diverse forms of knowledge, but also in defense of our work as scientists. Now, presumably, in response to critiques of the summit and critiques to their work, the chair of the science group published a paper noting that the summit cannot get bogged down in ideological battles. And I deeply sympathize and empathize with the frustration and slowness that comes from such battles. But as a sociologist, and I note that there was only, I think, one social scientist on that committee that was an economist who was the chair. But as a sociologist, I have to significantly disagree with this conclusion. These so-called ideological battles are at the core of transformations. They are the values that people aspire towards and the values that people hold. They represent the conflicts in society and in science about the pathways for transformation, and to ignore them is politically dangerous. Further, we have important evidence to show that exploring disagreements, that doing what Donna Haraway calls staying with the trouble, staying with that discomfort, being aware of incommensurability in these very difficult conversations, exploring disagreement is key for transformative change. It helps us reflect on our own positions and makes relations of power more visible. I think engaging with what are called ideological battles here, but what I would call disagreements in terms of vision and value, is fundamental because we know that science does not linearly translate to policy. So consider this example from the war in the Ukraine. So Cluster 6 of the European Commission has planned to push for investment in sustainable biogas, while the Committee on World Food Security's high-level panel of experts has called for a time-limited moratorium on biofuels from edible crops. We see very little clear lines of translation between the scientific experts and the policy. Policy is very, very messy, as is science, as I'm sure everyone here already knows. So moving forward, can we propose a new relationship? The idea that science, well synthesized, can lead to good governance erases the political role of decision makers. To claim that science must remain policy relevant, but not prescriptive, as we've heard through the IPCC, through IPBES, but also what I've been told as an expert on the Standing Committee for Agricultural Research Foresight team. To claim this is to uphold a problematic vision of the politics of objectivity in society and in science. We are working in a politicized domain. Failure to expose interconnections and power relations serves to reproduce them and can contribute to making things worse. Now, in this work we did on foresight, we came back together after the report was done to identify specific principles for transformative food system policy. And we started by thinking about the importance of doing this work, of doing the work of the science policy interface in an embedded context, in the idea of democratic directionality. Because what we found from our work and our engagement with different stakeholders was that actually, despite this polarized world that we're living in, coming to a common vision for future goals was not so difficult. We have the Paris Agreement, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, we have a general sense of what futures we want. That wasn't the problem. The problem was in the diverse pathways to get there. So we introduced this idea of democratic directionality. So democracy is a form of government in which people have authority to deliberate and debate and decide the futures they want, and directionality providing that goal. So in short, it's about debate and collective identification of collective goals to direct socio-ecological transformations. And these are then, to contextualize this, I should say, we have this is very much in the context of science and other knowledge holders being asked to inform policy, so engaging directly in a science policy interface. And we raised so many questions about our legitimacy. What is our right to make policy prescription? And this is a very politicized role. We took it very, very seriously. And for us, having these democratically defined or these broadly agreed upon goals was key to our work of then exploring the diverse transition pathways and recognizing that multiplicity of pathways. And we very much felt that our roles as scientists and researchers could be to identify the guardrails of the various pathways in terms of just and safe operating spaces. And we also felt that our key role as scientists could be to explore and deeply identify the trade-offs, to give those to people who are far more accountable to the public than we are in terms of our democratic mechanisms to actually then take the political decisions. So if we return back to our principles in this context of democratic directionality, what are the principles that help us as to engage with transformative food system policy research and to participate as stakeholders in this process? So the first one is responsibility, and responsibility reflects the ethical commitment of researchers and funders to these shared goals, to this democratic directionality. Attention needs to be paid to intended and unintended consequences of research application. Responsibility links knowledge or the lack thereof to consequences. It tries to make visible assumptions behind our research questions and demands deep understanding of our research contexts. It calls for the capacity to anticipate unintended consequences across goals and objectives. And it involves a willingness to change direction in light of new information about possibly unwanted or wanted impacts. It also recognizes limits of claims to scientific objectivity and neutrality. Our second principle relates to pluralism or plurality. It's not just diversity and inclusion. It absolutely includes disagreement and contestation. We need to have multiple forms of difference, multiple forms of values. These ideological debates need to be at the fore because they exist in science, in politics, and across our societies. And we even need to include the incommensurable ones. We need to understand these diverse pathways and explore them. We need to reject one-size-fits-all solutions. And in all of this fuzziness that comes from plurality and this discomfort, this true discomfort that comes from pluralism, we need to remember that exposure to diversity is a powerful driver of change, but that directionality can be very helpful in navigating this plurality. We also have to be very clear about exclusions, who and what to exclude and how to do this requires much more thinking from diverse groups of people. Collaboration is our third principle for transformative food systems policy, research for transformative food systems policy. And collaboration refers to transdisciplinarity, but transdisciplinarity, so bringing not just interdisciplinarity, not just multidisciplines, but really co-creating with diverse actors in the food system. This demands the allocation of adequate time and resources for interaction, communication, and knowledge management. And I have yet to observe a single multi-stakeholder process or collaboration effort that truly does a good job of this. We're trying at the Center for Unusual Collaborations, but that's a very small scale. Collaboration means also overcoming obstacles that stem from different visions, different languages, different styles of working. This requires specific skills, tools, and strategies. And these need to be fostered, funded, recognized, and rewarded. Collaboration demands that we move out of the contexts where our knowledge is dominant and effective. These are the nice places that we like to operate in, but we need to move out of these spaces. It also calls on us to reject predetermined notions of how to provoke change. And the fourth and final principle is about openness. And this includes the freedom to access research outputs, data, and tools where appropriate, and to multiply collaborative opportunities between researchers and citizens. It's about also, though, distributing resources to contribute to a level playing field or even unleveling the field in favor of those most affected. It's about comprehensibility and translation efforts. It's not about dumbing down our language or avoiding our concepts, but using language without simplifying complexity that can help others understand where we're coming from. We need to be open to diverse forms of knowledge and knowledge systems. And we need open science because this is necessary to stimulate change, challenge power structures and assumptions, and better align scientific research with transformation. And with this, I turn to the end of our story. So to recap, we started setting the scene in uncertain times and reflected on the complexity of the challenges ahead. We reflected on the role of governance, in particular, the importance of legitimacy and authority, not just as elements of good governance, but also as tools through which people claim power. We were then introduced to the solution of the emperor in the form of a high-level global summit that thrust food systems on the agenda, and not a moment too early. In light of this, we considered resistance to the summit. We reflected on what it means to position the summit in line with the all affected principle, where all stakeholders are clearly not the same. And we reflected on the rise of multi-stakeholder governance and multi-stakeholderism and the threat this poses to public governance, raising important questions about accountability. From here, the hero maybe enters the story. We see science enter the sphere in ways that have sought to claim legitimacy and authority within the context of the summit, possibly restricting diverse perspectives and reinforcing status quo, thereby threatening transformation. And we conclude with a new relationship between society and science and policy. And those of you who are following the science policy interface debates will see the new report from the European Commission today on a high level on the science policy interface. I think it's called Everyone Around the Table, which is a bit ironic maybe in the context of the discussions on the all affected principle. But here, I think that report, I haven't read it in full depth, but here the report calls for moving beyond a science policy interface to a science policy society interface. And with colleagues, we've called for science knowledge governance interfaces to go even farther, to reflect the diverse forms of knowledge that exist in the diverse processes that lead to policy. Based on democratic directionality and the 4 principles which call on us to be humble, but deeply rigorous with our approaches and continue to engage with the politics that inform our results and the results of our work. So my reason for shaping this talk around stories should by now be quite obvious. We need new narratives. We need new stories to support more equitable and impactful governance arrangements for our food systems. By way of next steps, I want to conclude by recognizing that science has a key role to play, but so do other actors. But we need to disempower dominant approaches. We need to prioritize marginalized approaches to generate much needed understanding of obstacles to action. We need to understand why these decades of hard work haven't led to the kinds of changes that have been called for and that are now urgently needed. We need policy to shift towards supporting more ambitious agendas of system transformation. And above all, I would say we need to get very comfortable with being uncomfortable if we truly want these kinds of transformations. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention and time, because that is a very valuable resource.
Thank you very much, Jess, for that very, very stimulating and very clear and well put together talk. Thank you very much indeed. Certainly got me thinking, as I'm sure it has our participants today. So thank you. It's a wonderful paper, by the way, the paper on democratic directionality. I'd recommend it to anyone.
It only took 3 years.
All the best papers take that long.
20 authors, 3 years, but we did it. So for those young scholars, keep going.
So look, I wanted to start from a question from a relatively young scholar, Tamwin. She thanks you for a great presentation and says, given the most affected principle that you talked about, what is my role as a researcher if I'm not part of the most affected group? Can one still have a voice and a role to play, or are we potentially doing more harm than good by getting involved and coming from a biased point of view? How best does one manage this? It's a question that I've been asking myself as well, even though much more on the elder side, but I think there are many of us in this space who are asking questions about our own role. So I wanted to start with that one.
That is a really powerful question. Thank you. And yeah, I'm struggling with it myself. So maybe, Corinne, also a dialogue with you would be most welcome. Do we have a role to play? Absolutely. Multiple roles to play. I think everybody, maybe I'll step back a bit. I do a lot of work with social movements, and I draw a lot on social movement theory. And one of the key theories in social movements is the different roles that people have to play. So you have the extreme folk who are going to chain themselves at Heathrow and who are going to blow up pipelines, and they play a role in the movement. That is not a role I can play well. I don't do well in those situations. I admire their commitment. Great. It's not for me. There are people who can be very good at promoting the values and mobilizing the grassroots. There are people who can play these connecting roles. So people who, myself, for example, I have after 20 years of working with food sovereignty movements, I've gained a lot of trust, but also in my position with a PhD at this university, I'm able to facilitate discussions between policymakers and civil society. And that's one of the roles that I played as a researcher during the efforts during the Food System Summit buildup, was facilitating dialogues here in the Netherlands between policymakers and activists to try and understand each other's positions. In terms of your role as a researcher, this is a huge debate that we're having all the time in the food sovereignty movement as researchers. What is our role in these politicized spaces, particularly given that they have governance structures that prioritize the most affected? So NGOs also don't have a strong role in these movements in terms of political voice often. They shouldn't, according to the governance structures of these movements. I'm thinking specifically, for example, of the Nyaleni structure, but also the civil society mechanism, or civil society and indigenous peoples mechanisms, the agroecology networks that are being established around the world. These are prioritizing the voices of particular people, those who are most affected, and we are not necessarily most affected, that's clear. And I think being humble and aware of that is important, but we have a role to play in serving as allies and speaking up when they need help with research, if that's your politics. We have a role to play in indeed identifying these trade-offs. We have a role to play in being humble and listening. We have a role to play in vocalizing their perspectives. So I think that's something that I've done here on this talk, for example, in understanding the concerns that movements had around what they saw as a threat to these autonomous spaces that they'd secured in these global negotiation processes being dismantled by a new wave of governance. So yeah, I don't know, Corinne, how do you, maybe we can interview here a little bit. How do you manage, because you're a huge public figure, how do you negotiate impact and responsibility with, the role we have also as scientists to protect our own scientific research?
Well, I don't think I've got the answers, and I'm certainly, as I said, grappling with it myself. But I think I've tried to reflect on what it is that I can do. And one of the things that I think I can do is when I'm in a very privileged situation, of being asked to participate in something or to do something at a certain level, to see if I can disperse that opportunity among different voices. I have a particular commitment to women from around the world, and co-founded a leadership initiative called Next Generation, which is designed to do that. But I'm still conscious of my own position and privilege, and coming as a white British woman. And I'm also conscious that if you step aside, then even more powerful people are likely to step in, as opposed to those who have less power. So I think I see that it is a responsibility for us to take, and the constant challenge is having time and managing all of the different things that we have to manage in order to make time to do that. So that's where I am at the moment. But yeah, still grappling with it.
I'm also grappling. And I just saw in the chat something came up from Mediha, if I may, about redirecting resources, something you just referenced. And one of the frustrations I have, and this comes back to the question, what's the role of researchers? One of the role of researchers, at least from my perspective, who have an emancipatory agenda or a commitment to social justice, is to challenge our institutions. For the projects I'm in, give no possibility to compensate stakeholders and participants while demanding participant engagement. And I think that sets up such a, it's problematic to pay people to participate, and it's problematic not to pay people to participate, right? These are these conundrums that we have to grapple with. And we're trying to find creative methods for valuing, and maybe even in non-capitalist terms, but truly valuing the time that we ask of people when we claim to want to do this participatory work, when we want participants at the table, when we want the vulnerable and the marginalized at the table. What does that mean? And how do we do that in equitable ways that don't, undermine their livelihoods in certain ways or aren't extractivist? It's yeah.
No, it's very difficult. I remember having a conversation years ago with the great Mark Winnie, the American who has worked for many years in food insecurity in the US. And I remember when he first started to undertake participatory processes, inviting women to meetings in the evening. And it was only when one turned up with the child and was completely unable to concentrate because of having to play the dual role of caregiver and participant at the same time. It was impossible to do. It was a kind of a realization that you mentioned resources, which are also critically important, but all of those issues about creating space which actually works for people is important. It's important from a policy perspective as well, of course. So the thing is, it all takes a lot more thinking. It slows things down. It means you have to reflect more. And with the conversation today, all of it about urgent, quick. In fact, I think we need to slow down a bit. Even though the questions that we have are urgent, we need to have more time to think and reflect. Because sometimes I think these things happen just because people haven't had time to reflect and think about it.
I could not agree with you more. We had an impact day here at Wageningen University. We're focused a lot on food and agriculture. We're in all the food and agriculture debates, and it was an impact day, and I was asked to speak, and I said the biggest impact we could have is to do less, actually, to stop and think. And I'll re-invoke this idea of Donna Haraway of staying with the trouble. Like researchers should defend that space to stay with the trouble and to work through this uncomfortableness. And she uses the metaphor of tentacular thinking, this tentare from the Latin, to tentacles, to try, to explore. And I think, if I can encourage researchers, young researchers especially, this is the gift that our roles provide, is this opportunity at certain phases in our careers to think and work through. And I agree with you, Corinna. We need to slow down and find a discomfort in that balance between the urgency to act and the will to act, and then staying with the trouble.
Thank you. Let me go to some. We've got a lot of questions coming in here. And I wanted to ask one from Lucy, who says, thanks you for your wonderful presentation. And ask you about the vision of transformation. Like you mentioned in your talk, that the vision we can kind of broadly agree on the world we want. But she says, I take your point that what is often painted as ideological battles are disagreements about the vision of transformation. My question then is whether you believe that there is or can be one agreed upon vision for a transformed food system. If not, how can other non-multilateral, non-food system spaces support a vision that is not agreed on?
Yeah, this is what I want to spend the rest of my life working on, Lucy. So I don't know, but I'd love to talk more about it. I think in the broadest sense, it's not hard to get agreement on a future vision. I think we want to end hunger. We want healthy food systems. We want clean air. We want some form of justice. These kind of broad principles, these normative, broad global principles, things that the UN's really good at. It takes work, but it's not perfect, but there's general, if not consensus, consent about these broad principles. But for me, where it gets messy and exciting as a sociologist is indeed the different pathways to get there. I think it's not only not possible to propose one pathway towards this this future, and it could be multiple futures, because there's variety in that future, there's pluralism, but it's dangerous to assume one future. It's one pathway towards that future, insofar as it ignores the diverse context, the diverse values, the diverse experiences, the diverse histories that that exist in our world, and that complexity cannot be ignored. And that's what was so exciting about the Food Systems Summit and this idea of bringing in systems thinking, because we thought, I think a lot of us thought, yes, finally, like we're going to grapple with this complexity and make it more operationalizable in these global spaces. And I don't know the degree to which I mean, that's a long-term process, right? And it's succeeded to some degree. But yeah, I don't know if it's possible or even desirable to come up with one vision. And indeed, I think the work is in finding discomfort, acceptable levels of discomfort amidst those competing visions. And I think the work around anticipatory governance, the work around reflexive governance is really important here, but also the work around the importance of disagreement and how we can actually make productive use of this disagreement, how we can find what Chantal Mouffe calls agonistic harmony in seeing each other as not as enemies, but as opponents, and sort of strengthening our own worldviews and expanding our own worldviews by engaging with each other, and exploring these differences. So I see myself here in Wageningen really in the belly of the beast in many ways. So many of the key actors that whose ideological visions I would challenge, and who certainly would challenge my own ideological visions to maintain that language, are here on this campus. And we're starting to open up possibilities for these deep debates, and it's really helpful to humanize these other actors in the food system, and to try and see, to not try and seek consensus, but to understand the boundaries of each and the limitations of each of our approaches, and see where we can learn from each other, and where we just can agree that there's differences, and both pathways, so long as they don't lead us to ecological collapse, are acceptable within the context of our vision.
No, it's a really important point that you're making about being comfortable, being uncomfortable. And I mean, you've written about this in your earlier work around making sure that conflict is out there. Like, there's nothing wrong with accepting that there is conflict, whereas I think I guess it's an issue where some people just, or because of the structural situations, it becomes seen as negative to somehow that this conflict is revealed, rather than just saying this conflict exists and it's actually okay. But we need to navigate it, and we need to invest some time in navigating it. And I think that it's something that people run away from, I guess, as part of the process, partly maybe because it takes time. But you've talked about the messiness of some of these processes, and the inclusion and the making sure that marginalized voices and so on are really dominant and heard in that system. But there might be instances, and I'd like to ask a question from Hattie here, where activist and community-led initiatives become overpowered by specific powerful dominant voices, which are part of the activist movement, that aren't necessarily representative. If that's something you've encountered, what's been your experience of that, and how can you navigate that very messy situation?
Yeah, no, that is inevitable. I mean, people who are drawn to leadership roles and movements are usually very charismatic and do well in positions of power and positions of influence. No movement is perfect, and certainly movements are very susceptible to being co-opted or being sort of usurped by particularly strong voices. What I found particularly interesting in terms of studying the different mechanisms that, in particular, food sovereignty movements have used over the last 40 years to avoid that, and why I find the food sovereignty, one reason I find the food sovereignty movement so interesting to study is because they have managed to maintain this movement over and to become a very influential, global, powerful movement at different levels, right? And one of the reasons I think that they have been successful, well, based on my research, where we feel we analyze them as being successful, is because they have paid a lot of attention to power concentration and representation. And so they have rotating chairs. It's never, the Via Campesina, for example, rotates by country. So you don't get a country block necessarily dominating. And it's not perfect. I'm not saying it's perfect, but you also have quotas to ensure that youth and women are adequately represented in these spaces, not just present, but actually like participating. You have now they're starting to have more discussions around other identities, LGBTQIA plus are also kind of being identified as unique constituency categories that need representation and that can be open to having, you know, an additional quota. And in securing, what we've shown in our research is that by making very visible these distinct political identity categories, and by attributing quota to them, you create a very politicized space, but it also becomes a lot harder for any particular group to grab power and to sort of dominate. Now, certainly there are voices who do that, but movements tend to have their own unique accountability systems. And if you're not representing your movement, you're not there for very long. That's been my experience. Maybe Patty, you have a more specific experience. We could talk about it through email, perhaps, if you have a particular case in mind. But in terms of the movements that I've been studying at the global level, particularly at the global level, yeah, their voices don't always turn over quickly, but I think that there are important mechanisms in place to ensure that. And that doesn't mean that agrarian movements, for example, aren't dominating. We know that La Via Campesina dominates in these spaces at the expense of fisher movements and pastoralist movements. But I think there's strong efforts at play there. I think this is also interesting in terms of discussions around intersectionality and how that are, I think, fundamental to improving equality, but how do you ensure intersectionality in this moment of very concrete identity categories? Do you then need to create, for example, quotas for race, and how would that work? How do you make LGBTQI quotas that become separate, or is it part of, you know, each individual constituency, and does that lead to important separations where we need convergence? These are questions that require a lot of research and smarter brains, I think.
No, it's a great answer. Thank you, Jess. Let's move now to some questions about local and municipal level. And Nicole asked, there were some very exciting examples of food democracy at the local and municipal level, but these localities often run into misalignment, perverse incentives and policy barriers at higher levels of government. So the first question is, what mechanisms could help align food policies at different levels of government? And if I can just add a question from Joy here as well. And she says, at a city level or city region level, what is the best approach, do you think, to take in navigating these challenges, but to address food systems change by bringing together local actors to create plans and collaborate on action? So a couple there on city and local level approach.
Wow, yeah. First of all, I hope those people are in the food policy master's program, because these are really important questions that I know you're actually leading on, Krina. So I feel a bit shy talking too much about this, but indeed, I think some of the very exciting examples right now in terms of novel governance, in terms of transformational governance, is happening at the level of the municipalities. This is a really exciting moment. And yet there is misalignment, and I'm not sure. I mean, this is how do we do multi-level governance? This is the big question, right? I think it's okay to have some degree of misalignment. I think that the global I see really as the normative space, creating this democratic directionality. The national, it's a slow moving machine. It's got a number of competing priorities. The municipal is where we have space for this. And I think the clearest thing that we can do in terms of enhancing the alignment to support these new food democracy efforts is to translate the barriers very clearly up the stream, to identify with very concrete case studies, very concrete examples to policymakers where that misalignment is, and to identify the actors who can actually support in realigning or at least reducing barriers. And I think the work that Corinne and her team and Kelly have done on sort of mapping out what that space is in terms of policy integration and policy actors is really fundamental. And I hope we can do that in other country contexts, because I haven't seen that degree of specificity and reflection in other places. I think here in the Netherlands, we have a Ministry of Food, we have food partnerships that are specifically linking networks of municipalities to the national government, also with the provinces. So here in the Netherlands, there are really, I think, innovative mechanisms to ensure alignment, but it's a very geographically quite a small country. So that helps in that way. In terms of the best approaches to collaborate, I think paying attention, coming back to what Corinne and I were talking about earlier, paying attention to who's at the table and what time they're coming to the table and what they're being fed at the table, making sure that these spaces are equitable and accessible to the people they claim to want to engage with. Because if we come back to that first question about food democracy at the municipal level, they're also heavily criticized for being white middle-class movements, because these are, and we also need to think about why that is and what we can do to ensure that space is made for other visions of the food system, to ensure that the kinds of localism that we're promoting, the kinds of visions for our food system aren't actually undermining other people's visions that we are trying to act in solidarity with. Sorry, it's not the most comprehensive answer, but I would also come back to you and your expertise on municipal governance and multi-level integration.
Well, let me pass back to the questions here, because there's a lot of, I'm happy to answer it, but I don't want to take up space. So let me go back to a couple of questions, see if we've got time at the end. Andrea asked, she said, I wonder whether multi-stakeholderism and its lived experience for marginalized groups may in fact help to politicize more people because of the experience that people have had of it, I think she means, and lead to more engaged citizens who reclaim space and return to fight for power.
I love that analysis, Andrea. I think there's a lot to that. I haven't studied that empirically yet. If you want to, let me know, that would be fun. Indeed, what I've noticed speaking to farmers, when we talk about consultation, some of the most consulted stakeholders are farmers. And they're sick of it. They're sick of, for the last 30 years being told, telling the same story and getting no action. And they're sick of being, here in the Netherlands, we're having a huge farmer protest tomorrow, because for the last 30 years, my university in particular has promoted a particular vision of intensive agriculture. And now we're saying, actually, no, you all have to stop and change the way you do agriculture basically overnight to address the nitrogen crisis here in our country. And those farmers, key stakeholders in our food system, are deeply frustrated and deeply, and they've been highly politicized in very antagonistic ways as a result of having been in many ways over consulted through these multi-stakeholder processes. But we certainly see the frustration of over consultation of groups of people, and the way in which that's leading to, I don't know if it's actually leading to more engaged forms of citizenship, or if it's leading to fatigue, burnout, and malaise about this kind of work. And that's also why I would deeply, coming back to that first question about the role of researchers, if you want to do participatory research, you really need to ensure for the future of science that you do that deliberately and carefully, because there's too many people going out there without appropriate skills for focus groups and consultation of groups, without any kind of accountability or effort to reflect on the impact of that, to ensure there's no extractivism, as I think I already mentioned, and to ensure that there's follow-up. It's something that our academic timelines certainly don't allow. I think NGOs are maybe in the same boat, and it's felt, and it leads to a lack of mistrust in science. And I
think that's such an important point about going back to the question about researchers, and the role is making sure that you are kind of at least are aware of all of those issues, and there's so much written and understood about those issues now. And certainly the researchers that we have at the Centre for Food Policy who are experts on doing this, it's something that is very important to us. We don't necessarily get it right, but we certainly try. Because it's, especially working with people who experience marginalization of different types, it's unethical not to do that. So but let me move on to something else that, as you know, before, let me just ask Lopa's question we were just talking about multi-stakeholderism then, and you made the distinction in your presentation between multi-stakeholderism and multilateralism.
Yeah.
And Loba just says, could you please expound on that difference, please?
Of course, yeah. Here I'm really, well, one of the privileges of doing work with movements is they're usually way ahead analytically than academics. And I take this really then from the engagement with movements. I want to just be very clear where I'm getting this idea from. And they've, since at least 2016, have been really warning about this process of multi-stakeholders, this idea that we are increasingly seeking to put forward types of governance that takes political decision-making away from public servants or public decision makers, public policy makers who are accountable to populations through our democratic processes, overwhelmingly, but not entirely. And putting that decision, so putting those decisions into the hands of, into these multi-stakeholder platforms, which are not tied to any political body, where ownership is not clear. And I gave that example from that report where there are, these experts from the European Commission are actually calling for multi-stakeholder processes that are stakeholder owned, and without actually articulating who would own it, who would fund it, who would sustain it, who would translate it. So that distinction is that multi-stakeholderism as governance through stakeholders serves to undermine the role of the state, the role of government to take very political decisions. And this is my normative standpoint. I know governments haven't done always the best job, but from where I stand as a governance scholar, they remain the beacon of hope for me in terms of people, at least in the context where I live. This is my very Western position here, but they are the most accountable mechanism that we have for implementing change, and they're the most accountable and responsible for that. And if we continue to put forward this idea of, if we continue to advance multi-stakeholder governance, we continue to hollow out or take away that responsibility. And I think that we need to be doing far more. We need to be pushing states to stand up, to take those really hard decisions. And coming back to the role of researchers, a key role is identifying what the nuance of those trade-offs are going to be, to systematically analyze with the best of our scientific capacities. Yeah, what it means to take these hard decisions. Maybe I can give a quick anecdote. So for my PhD way back in 2010, when the Committee on World Food Security was reforming, there was this moment where civil society had a lot of influence and energy, and the chair of the reform committee said, do you want civil society to have voting rights on par with states? And this was a huge debate because within the UN, that's generally not the case. And second of all, yeah, wouldn't that be amazing to have this power of voting alongside states? That would be radical in terms of governance and, wow, real people's voice. And after a lot of deliberation, the movements decided that no, we are not accountable to anybody but our own movements. There's no formal negotiation like to get us here. They were aware of the limitations of the representation. I think something Hattie also mentioned in her comment. And so they actually just went back to the chair and said, no, we're not gonna try and push for voting rights within this committee. What we're gonna do is sit here and push our positions on par with other stakeholder groups like the private sector and researchers, for example. And then states are accountable to those decisions. They take the decisions in the committee context, and we then hold them accountable for those decisions. I think that's a really nice illustration of what I mean by multilateralism, those states coming together, taking the tough decisions through public policy and not giving up that responsibility to these very ungrounded multi-stakeholder platforms.
Thank you. Now let's move on to the UN Food Systems Summit, which you mentioned, of course, a lot in your talk. Yanni is asking you to reflect a bit on the legacy of the UN Food Systems Summit 1 year on. Has it, in your view, had any lasting impact?
Oh, Yanni, hi, first of all. Second of all, yeah, I think it has had lasting impact. I think one of the sort of late things that came through the summit was this idea of the role of states eventually kind of caught up. States began to kind of panic at the end of the lead up and start to think more about their role. And these national commitments and national action plans have been put forward. I think they're, at least what I see in the Netherlands and what I've seen through working on at the European level, is that these have influence in terms of policy, in terms of national policy, at least, in terms of vision. But I think that the crisis in the Ukraine and the crisis right now could serve to, to roll back any progress and any outcomes that you're on. I think the debates we're seeing around, for example, the farm to fork, in terms of, so I'm sorry, I'm from a very European perspective now, but this commitment in the European farm to fork strategy to commit to reduce pesticide use by 50% is being really challenged by actors in terms of the current context of and refocusing on food security. So yeah, I think that the legacy, there is space to play, I think, also in terms of agroecology. And this is a very biased view because I follow these particular elements. The food system was so huge, but also in terms of agroecology, I think there has been a lot of mobilization around these 13 principles for agroecology that are promising. But I don't see a lot of mobilization. I see sort of vague references. I see, at least in the Dutch context, yes, that there is reference to it. There is this idea of the national plan, but it doesn't have the kind of impact that one might have wanted to see. That would be my assessment from here. And I think part of that is now that we're facing this new wave of crises. I think COVID, everyone was exhausted by the end of like people are just, we need a break collectively. Like I think we're back to this issue of time. And that maybe there's a possibility to sort of stand back and think about the processes and learn from the critique and also from what went well with the summit and think through the next steps.
Okay, thank you. And let's go to a couple of questions about practical translation of this. Paige says, when you talk about dealing with power asymmetries and how to address them realistically, do you have some practical and ambitious practices you have identified in the research about practical ways of dealing with the power asymmetries? I think you've touched on some of this already in terms of what you've been talking to us already, but perhaps a bit further on that. And Jiggy also asks, how do you turn the great principles that you've set out and ideas into practical action on the ground?
Yeah, great. Okay, practicalities aren't my strength, but we'll try. I think first the practical advice is to be very aware of the context within which you are working. The histories, the dynamics, that's number one. The second is to make visible relations of power. So to acknowledge the differences in power and to make, in whatever space you're working in, very clear inclusion and exclusion criteria. And those can be whatever you need them to be, but those need to be clearly defined and translated in transparent ways. So within the movements that I work with, it's very clear that if you're not part of a movement, and a movement being very much defined as people fighting for their own rights rather than an NGO who is often organizing campaigns on behalf of others, if you're not there fighting for your own rights, you're in a different political category. So as scholars and as NGOs in the Nyeleni space, for example, we sit in a second tier. There's the political tier of movements who are the political leaders of the movement. And then there's the sort of second tier where we play facilitation support, we play organizational support, resource support, financially also where we can, and giving sort of legitimacy in particular moments when it's needed. I think that's one way. Other really practical ways include changing our methodologies, like not going in with the kind of PowerPoint that I gave today, which is not accessible. One of the strategies that we're using a lot in the Center for Unusual Collaborations is a way of dealing with power asymmetries as serious games. So recently I brought together a group of actors and had them model, 3D model their food systems anxieties. So we had Play-Doh, I don't know what you call that in England, but Play-Doh and little plastic figurines and scissors and tons of arts and crafts supplies. We looked like a kindergarten in a way, but we had groups, diverse groups of people come together and model together their food systems anxieties as a way of getting away from language and getting very tactical and being able to then talk through the anxieties we have with a view towards transformation eventually, but really starting with that collective feeling of grief that a lot of us have, and sitting with these kinds of emotions, and starting from emotions is a way that that humanizes us again, that gets us out of this role of like, you the bad corporation and you the radical activist and you the scientist who sits in your ivory tower, but it brings us together as humans. So in a project that I'm part of through the Center for Unusual Collaborations, we're developing a library of game mechanisms where we have not only people co-create different kinds of games that you can play in these diverse situations, but also we'll be having this library. And this is cool. We work with designers, so they actually look nice. And that's one of the things that we're doing. I'm gonna also be leading a project team on this in terms of participatory guarantee systems. So how do you get farmers to trust each other with their data? We're going to be designing games with them, co-designing games with farmers to build trust and to sort of enter into these different kinds of role plays. What's I think really important about serious gaming, if it's done and facilitated right, is that you can do it in ways that don't require strong language skills. They don't require literacy. They just require you to show up as a human and engage, and they represent really important entry points for organizing things in different ways and articulate and getting at the core of people's values or people's aspirations or people's frustrations with the various kinds of policies. So maybe we can push ourselves as scientists to use these more marginalized approaches as not only a way to disempower the kind of status quo, but also to engage more proactively with diverse groups of people.
No, it's fascinating, really, really interesting answer. Unexpected in a good way.
Okay.
And I think it's yeah, I mean, a lot can be learned from what you just said. Certainly some of the work that we're doing is trying to use visuals and graphics in new ways as well. It's not the same thing, but it's essentially about trying to create empathy through generating an emotional response. I don't mean contrived in a contrived way or a kind of a false way of trying to push people and manipulate people, but trying to help policymakers understand the positions and realities of people in positions of more marginalized positions. And creating empathy is very difficult, because how can you empathize with somebody who's in a very different situation to yourself? Yeah. So empathy is a bit of an overused word in that sense. But at the same time, there are connections between humans who are in very different spaces. And it's about finding that common humanity and ways to do that, which and sharing of experiences and providing the kinds of spaces, which is again something we try and do in the Next Generation Initiative, which I'm very interested by the idea of games and food systems anxieties as well. So thank you very much for that. And just to follow on, it was a question I was going to ask, but fortunately Jiggy has also asked this same question. What are the kinds of skills that are needed to do that, and to be open to that, and to think of that, and then to conduct these kinds of exercises of trying to address power asymmetries in this way? So particularly, she asked, in order to facilitate democratic directionality in the food system. But what are the kind of skills that you think are important?
Wow. Yeah. I think the skill to know when to stop talking and to listen. I think the skill of being able to translate different perspectives across the different ideological divides is really important. And this is something that I have to embarrassingly say I didn't do so well when I started this kind of work. Certainly I remember moments of my field work where I and doing my PhD where I thought I was understanding what different people were saying, and because I understood, I heard the words, but I didn't understand the way in which movement leaders talk in different kinds of metaphors, and I didn't understand the importance of sort of thinking beyond the words towards meanings. And that's a skill that I've had to learn. The skill of making space for people whose voices are, who want to speak and who aren't being sort of given that platform, and also the skill of shutting people down a bit, those who are talking too much. The skill of being humble, and the skill of being strong in your methods, because as researchers, that's what we have. We are not accountable. We are not legitimate in many spaces, but we have accountability to our methods, legitimacy in terms of our capacity to be experts in our field. So there's this sort of, yeah. And maybe the last point would be the skill to know your weaknesses and to collaborate, because doing facilitation is, like you said, Corinne, on your team you have great facilitators who can engage, and that's a unique skill that not everyone is suited to, in the way that not everyone is suited to coding, or not everyone is suited to teaching to the same degree. And yeah, we can all mumble through it, but these are real skills. Yeah, just recognizing the limits of your skills, the limits of your methodologies, and knowing how to build strong, trusting collaborations, which sounds so obvious, but it's so hard. Anyone who's tried to write a paper with anyone else knows this is so hard.
Yeah, no, indeed. We've come into the last 5 minutes. I'm terribly sorry to the participants, but I'm not going to be able to ask all of these fantastic questions. But I did want to go and ask some final questions, particularly on the paper that you shared with us about democratic directionality. And Taha asks, how do you imagine to implement democratic directionalities in countries that do not implement or recognize democracy, especially in our globally interconnected agri-food systems? Is there a possibility to implement such policy recommendations in a living lab? But the main question is how to implement that kind of approach where democracy is simply not recognized. And from Roberta, do you believe that the 4 principles proposed are able to be followed in every kind of food research?
In 5 minutes? Yeah.
It's hard to think about it at first for PhD research, for example. So she's a PhD researcher. Yeah, sorry.
No, it's good. I'll try.
These are difficult questions. I mean, they're fantastic questions.
Yeah, they are.
We put you through the mill.
Yeah, great. So, the question around how to support democratic directionality in countries where there isn't strong democratic or any democratic infrastructure. I think here democratic directionality has an even stronger role to play. What I've seen researching global level is that these normative frameworks that are negotiated in these global spaces can serve as a signpost, as soft law, if we want to call it that, or as these guiding principles or goals that actors can use to try and push for different visions of the food system, to claim particular rights in different fora. I know that's hard when you don't have democratic accountability, but I don't think democratic directionality is necessarily always tied to formal democratic structures. It's really this idea that there is collective debate and deliberation on the kinds of futures that people want, and then identifying the different pathways to getting there. And one of those might be destabilizing their governments, and others might be reinventing their government structures. So it's not a very strong answer in terms of practicalities, but I don't think we need to think of democratic directionality as having strong democratic institutions, but rather making space for strong deliberation. And I understand that's limited in a lot of contexts. So here, I think as researchers and allies and people who support movements, we can also play a role of drawing attention to spaces where people's human rights are being violated, and where these global normative principles are not in any way, shape, or form being respected. In terms of how the last question was which of the four, can we implement all the principles and which to prioritize?
Sorry, the question moved place now. Okay. Oh yeah, can the 4 principles be followed in every kind of research?
I hope so. I mean, when we wrote that paper, we had really like a lot of different kinds of science involved, but also policymakers and European Commission people. So we really had it was a research group, but very diverse research group. And I think I have trouble seeing, I think it's hard. I think it's risky for young scholars to try and do a lot of this work around pluralism, around collaborating too much before you have your set framework. So I would encourage you to think carefully about them and maybe strategically early on in your career if you want a science career. But I think there's a lot of space for, I think there's increasing amount of space and recognition given to these principles. And I think that, for example, yeah, responsibility needs to be 100% implemented, I would argue, and that's why we have ethics committees. Pluralism is tricky and maybe not something to be tackled in the context of like a PhD project, but certainly in terms of how you frame your engagement and consultation, that could be your research agenda, could be something there. And collaboration, I would highly encourage all researchers to collaborate. We know that collaborative science and collaborative research is not only sort of the way to go, but also having more impact in terms of the various metrics, which are indeed problematic, but metrics of impact. And openness to challenging your own assumptions, openness to challenging your methods, 100% should always be doing that. So I mean, yeah, one of the limitations of our 4 principles is that they're too accessible because they're the result of deep negotiation, and that's politics, right? Even in science. So despite that, I think they're still fundamentally important principles to reflect on in terms of our role as researchers in transition and transformation.
Fantastic, Jess. Well, I said I do apologise to those of you who haven't got to the questions of yet, but thank you very much, Jess, for really answering those questions so well, and for the participants asking such rich and insightful questions themselves. I certainly learned a lot from both the questions and the answers. So thanks very much. And thanks for the great and insightful and very thought-provoking talk. I can tell from the very long questions, we've had very long questions today, that it really did provoke a lot of thinking amongst the audience. So thank you very much, Jess. It's a pleasure to have you with us, and a pleasure to have you as participants with us. And with that, I wish everyone a good day. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you, Karina. Goodbye.